about the concept of Pesach, the holiday of freedom, and spiritual freedom is also difficult to achieve, and that's why we have to prepare a little bit by studying the ideas in the Torah and in the Kabbalah and Hasidic philosophy. So we have a lot of work. So what we're going to focus on today is a discourse from Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad, and it discusses the spiritual concept of matzah. But it begins with a very interesting series of questions, which it's just very basic questions of why we eat matzah. And it seems like the story that the Torah tells us in what we read in the Haggadah is not really consistent with the story that the Torah tells us. So we're all going to sit at the Seder in a week and a day, Saturday night, and we're going to say what the Haggadah tells us to say. We eat this matzah because, and it doesn't seem consistent with what the Torah tells us. Okay, so if I ask you, why do we eat the matzah? So you'll probably tell me what the Haggadah tells me and what your kindergarten teacher told you and what you saw in all the pictures, maybe in the movie as well, that the reason why we eat matzah is because the Jewish people did not have time, when they were leaving Egypt, the bread that did not have time to rise, and therefore they were rushed. So the bread that they baked did not have time to rise. So it wasn't chametz, it wasn't leavened bread, so it was matzah. And that's why, as a commemoration, we eat matzah. Right? Did I say anything you never heard before? That's the story that is told. The problem is that if you look back at Exodus, the book of Exodus, chapter 12, there it says clearly that God tells the Jewish people, when they're still in Egypt, 4 days before the Exodus, well, he told them 15 days before the Exodus, but he says on the 10th of the month, 10th of Nisan, you take a lamb and you prepare the lamb. And then on the 14th day, you slaughter the lamb, and that will be the Pesach offering, and you put the blood on the doorposts. And on the mashkef, I forget what it's called, on top, so you have blood. I'm sorry?
Lintel.
The lintel, yes. And then you have, and then you'll eat the Pesach offering, and you'll eat it with matzah. And according to the Talmud, that first Passover, they were supposed to eat matzah not 7 days, but 1 day. So I'm asking a very simple question. Why do we eat matzah? Do we eat matzah because the Jewish people, when they left, the bread did not have time to rise, and therefore they had matzah? Or do we eat matzah because the Torah told us to eat matzah on that day? So in other words, when you hear the conventional story, it sounds like it was a mistake. We were in a rush. The matzah, the bread did not have time to rise. So we left Egypt in a hurry. So we eat matzah. It was by mistake. If we had time, we would have ate bagels and lox. And then at the Seder, we would have bagels. But that's not necessarily consistent with what the Torah says, is that there was a specific commandment. They knew it 15 days in advance. They had a commandment that on the first day of Pesach, which would become the first day of Pesach, certainly at the Seder, you're going to eat matzah, and you eat matzah with the Paschal offering, and that's it. So it was no surprise. It was meditated. They had two weeks to prepare the matzah. So was the matzah a mistake? Was the matzah on purpose? In other words, meditated. And why do we eat the matzah? Do we eat the matzah, like the Haggadah says, because the bread did not have time to rise? Or do we eat the matzah because God told us to eat matzah with the Pesach offering? These are some of the questions that Rabbi Shneur Zalman begins this discourse about, which tries to get to the essence and the definition of matzah. Okay, now it gets even a little more complicated and technical to make the question a little bit stronger. Let's look at the time. Let's look at the timeline. Okay, so let's assume. So which one is true? Did the Jewish people, when they left that first original year, when the Jewish people left Egypt the first year, did they eat matzah because God told them to explicitly, or did they eat matzah because the bread did not have time to rise? Which one is true? Which story is true? So the answer is both stories are true. In other words, the Seder that they had in Egypt was the night of the 15th. But they had to be finished the Pesach offering. The Seder had to be over by midnight. That's, by the way, the reason that some people have the custom that they eat the afikoman before midnight. I don't know if it's a universal custom. It's a Chabad custom. At least on the first night, we finish the afikoman by midnight to commemorate the fact that when the Jewish people ate the Pesach offering, you had to be finished the Pesach offering by midnight. In other words, when they ate matzah twice that first initial year. The first matzah they ate was before midnight. In other words, for their Seder, God told them 2 weeks in advance that on the night between the 14th and the 15th, when in Judaism that's called the night of the 15th, the night preceding the day of the 15th, you're going to eat your Pesach offering with a matzah sandwich. And that was no surprise. That was prepared. That's what they knew. We will call that the matzah before midnight. Clear? Matzah before midnight. In addition, there was another story that happened the next day when they actually left. When did they leave? They left during the day on the 15th at midday. When they left, they also were chased out of Egypt. So they happened to have dough, and the dough did not have time to rise. So they ate matzah. So that first original year, there was not one matzah that they ate. There were two matzahs. There was matzah before midnight. That was by the divine commandment. And then there was the matzah after midnight that just so happened to be. It happened to be that they were in a rush. So the dough did not have time to rise. So they ate matzah. So that's part of the story that they ate matzah because the dough did not have time to rise. So I started out telling you these two stories. And now I'm telling you both stories are true. One happened before midnight, and one happened what we'll call after midnight, which means the next day. So far, it's clear. The problem is that we're going to sit in our Seder before midnight and say, right, our Seder is before midnight, and we're going to say, we eat matzah. You know why we eat matzah? Because of the matzah the Jewish people ate after midnight. Why don't we say we'll eat matzah because of the matzah the Jewish people ate in Egypt before midnight by divine commandment, not because the dough did not have time to rise? So there's something interesting here. We're sitting before midnight and we're talking about the matzah the Jewish people ate after midnight. So that is the sort of the questions that's going to lead us into the discussion of what is the spiritual energy of matzah, and what does matzah represent, and how do we achieve a level of matzah? But these are the questions. If the questions may be a little bit technical, but if they're clear, we'll continue unless anybody has any questions about the questions. Any questions about the questions? So the questions are clear.
Well, the questions are clear, but maybe because the whole anticipation and in a hurry kind of attitude was present in the before midnight matzah.
No. Before midnight matzah, there was no hurry. The Jews had 14 days to prepare. They knew 14 days in advance that they're going to have to eat on the night between the 14th and the 15th. They're going to have to slaughter in the afternoon of the 14th. They're going to slaughter an animal, a sheep or a goat. They're going to roast it. They're going to eat it with bitter herbs and matzah. There was absolutely no surprise. There was no surprise.
But they were thinking about the next morning. They will have to be in the
first.
They didn't
know. That was my mistake. The next morning they didn't know. The next morning it wasn't meditated. The next morning they weren't planning on eating matzah. So happens to be they were chased out, so the dough did not have time to rise. But that's the next morning. That wasn't their original Seder. Now we are commemorating the Seder that the Jewish people ate in Egypt. When God tells the Jewish people about the first Seder, he says, this is what you'll do every year. From now on going forward to commemorate the Exodus, every year we will do a repeat of that Seder that the Jewish people performed in Egypt. Okay, so if it's a repeat, then it's a repeat of the matzah before midnight, which was not a rush, which was not a surprise, which was a commandment from God. So we should sit at our Seder and we say at the end of the Haggadah, we put our hands, some people put our hands on the matzah, some people look at the matzah, but we say, this matzah that we eat, al shumma, what is it for? Why do we eat this matzah? Because the dough was not able to rise. Really? Why don't we eat matzah? Because that first year God commanded us to eat a Pesach offering, a sandwich with matzah. Isn't that the more accurate story? So the answer is, well, there are two stories. There's two reasons why the Jewish people ate matzah twice. But then that leads to the question, why then are we, when we're sitting in our Seder before midnight, why are we evoking the story of after midnight instead of evoking the story of before midnight?
Because we are after midnight.
Oh, okay. You must be a Kabbalist. Okay, I'm just going to take 1 second to open up the Haggadah text just to make it more clear so you don't have to trust me. I don't like when people believe me. I like when you have the evidence before you. Chabad.org just made a beautiful new Haggadah, which I'm going to share, downloaded. Let's see how long it takes to download. And it's free, and you can download it, or you could order it on Amazon if you wanted. You could download it for free or order a hard copy on Amazon. I'm going to wait. I'm going to see if I can download it within the next 15 seconds. I'll share the screen and I'll show the problem with the story, and then we'll get to the Hasidic the Kabbalistic interpretation, which is an expansion of what Vicky's idea. So I'll give you the spoiler. The spoiler alert is that there are two levels of matzah, and in Egypt they had they took two stages to get to those two separate levels of matzah. But for us, we can do both at one. We can do both together. So we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, here's my beautiful Haggadah. Let's share it. Let's share it. It's going to be quite toward the end of, whoops. Let's see where this is going to take us. Things are freezing up over here for some reason. Oh, Karpas. No, we still got a way to go. Yachatz. Okay, I think I'm going to leave this alone. Oh, beautiful. Look, it got to the right page.
This is the first edition, I see.
I'm sorry?
It's the first edition, right?
What do you mean? Oh, yeah.
In the beginning of the very first page, I noticed. The first
yes,
edition.
The first, yeah.
Chabad. Nice.
Okay, so they made it for this year. And like I said, you can go to Chabad.org and download it, or you can go to Amazon and print it and get a hard copy. Okay, here we go. Now hold on to the top two matzahs inside their cloth, and let's say together. That's our custom. I don't know. I think most maybe some they hold the matzah toward the end. Basically, the introduction, a little before that, it says anyone who did not say. Where are we? Okay, this is an interesting piece. The essentials. Where are we? Now that we're finishing off the story of the Exodus, it's important to mention that Rabbi Gamliel used to say he would say that anyone who didn't mention the following three things on Passover didn't really do the Seder right. This translation is a little bit not precise, but you get the point. He's saying you must say these three things. What are they? Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. Actually, you have to not just mention them, but you have to explain. So why do we eat Pesach? Well, that's easy because when the temple stood, we offered a Pesach offering. Fine. I'm sorry, because when we were in Egypt, God leaped over our homes. Okay, here comes the key. This matzah that we eat, what is it all about? It's because the dough of our ancestors hadn't had enough time to rise when suddenly the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He, revealed Himself to them and liberated them. Just like it says in the story, they baked matzah from the dough that they had brought out of Egypt because it hadn't risen, because they had been chased out of Egypt and didn't have a chance to stick around long enough to pack anything else to eat. Okay, that's the translation from Tzvi Freeman. It's not precise, but you get, he's trying to convey the message. Okay, what are we saying? We eat matzah because the day after the Jewish people had their Seder, they left, they didn't have time to rise. But why don't we eat matzah? Because they ate matzah in Egypt as part of their Seder, which was by divine commandment, not by mistake. That was the question. And I just showed you this verse. I just showed you this matzah. I just showed you the verse so you could see it in the Haggadah. And you know that I am telling you what it says in the Haggadah and not just making up stories because it's Passover. Okay, so we'll pull this up again when we need to. So let's give a little introduction here. We want to figure out what's matzah, what is matzah, what is bread, and then we want to dig in. So I'm going to take 2-3 minutes to talk about the thing that the first introduction. There's a few introductions that Rabbi Shneur Zalman offers. This introduction is a Kabbalistic concept that Rabbi Shneur Zalman writes many places in his book, Torah and Likkutei Torah. He writes it many, many places, but here is one of the places where it's elaborated upon. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman points out an interesting question from the Kabbalistic perspective. Well, when we look about how life sustains itself, how does life sustain itself? So we understand that there's a food chain, and the creatures that are higher on the food chain, they eat the lesser creatures, right? So the higher you are on the food chain, you could eat what's below you. So if you are a blade of grass, you live off the earth. If you're an animal, you could eat off the blade of grass. If you're a human, you could eat an animal, right? So every step of the food chain lives off something that's less than its less sophisticated and less advanced form of life. And that's what we take for granted. But the Kabbalah asks a simple question. I understand that's the way it works. We're more powerful, so we can overtake those lesser forms of life. But how is it possible that a lesser form of life has what it takes to fuel a higher form of life? In other words, why does the food give us sustenance? So the simple answer, the physical answer, the biological answer is because this food has nutrients. But the spiritual answer is because it's like it says in Deuteronomy, that man does not live on bread alone, but man lives by the word of God. And the Kabbalists explain that means that man lives by the word of God that's within the bread. So the bread has a spark of energy, a divine spark of energy. And when we eat the bread, in addition to the physical nutrients, we're also getting the spark of God. And the spark of God is able to sustain us. That's the Kabbalistic view. If that's the case, then why does the human being who has a higher form of divine energy within himself or herself, why do I have my own spark? Why do I need a lower spark to sustain me? That's the Kabbalistic question. And the Kabbalistic answer, and the Kabbalistic answer is consistent with many things that the Kabbalah says, is that everything, when something is lower on this world, it's because it has a higher source. So something that fell very low in this world it really has a higher source. So in a sense, even though the spark of God that's within the bread fell much lower than the spark of God that's within the human, nevertheless, it has a higher source, which is why when I consume the bread gives me life, because the bread is higher than me. Even though on the food chain, I'm higher, but in the spiritual source, what's lower in the food chain actually has a higher source. This is a Kabbalistic doctrine of kol hagavoya biyoter, something that's higher falls lower. There are many metaphors for this concept, right? If you have a brick wall and the wall will fall, so the brick that was on the top of the wall falls farther from the base of the wall than the brick that's on the bottom, right? The brick that's on the bottom on the first or second row falls very close to the wall. The one that was very high falls very low, falls very far. And that's a Kabbalistic doctrine that when you look around and you see something here that's so negative and so distant from God, yes, but its source is much higher. Which is why, says the Kabbalah, the Talmud says that a child cannot call their father until it tastes grain. Until a child can taste grain, the child does not have the awareness and to be able to articulate recognizing the father. The mother, the child could recognize immediately. The father, it's more complicated. So what is the mystical interpretation of this idea? The idea is that the spark of God that's within the bread gives the person a certain awareness because the bread has a higher source than the human being. That's about bread every day. That's mentioned multiple places in teachings of the Kabbalah and Hasidic philosophy. What we're going to say now, and why we're bringing this idea in here, is because we're going to say what bread does to the person physically, in other words, gives the person physical life. Matzah, which is spiritual bread, does to the person spiritually. In other words, just like the child has a certain awareness of his father once he tastes the grain, that's what the Talmud says. And we explained it's because the bread has a spark of God that's in some sense in its source superior to the spark of God that's within the human being. So too, when a person eats the spiritual bread, which is the matzah, what happens when you eat grain? You get an awareness of your Father. What happens when we eat matzah? We get an awareness of our Father in heaven. So the bread, the spiritual bread of Passover, what it does is it gives us the awareness of Hashem. And we're going to connect it to what the Zohar says later, that matzah is the bread of faith. The Zohar quotes that the matzah is the bread of faith. What does bread of faith mean? When you eat the matzah, you get an awareness of God's presence. So it's not just bread, it's spiritual bread. And just like regular bread could add awareness to the person, the spiritual bread adds spiritual awareness to the person. So that's introduction number one. Now we get to introduction number two, and this is when it's also interesting. Introduction number two is that if you look, I'm just going to put up the screen because it'll be a little bit easier. If you look at the word matzah, the way it's spelled in the Hebrew, this is a verse. This is the verse that says they baked the bread, the dough that they took out of Egypt, cakes of matzah, because it did not have time to rise because they were chased out of Egypt and they could not delay and they didn't make other provisions for themselves. So this is talking about the matzah after midnight. How do you spell matzot in the plural? Mem, tzadik, vav, taf. It has a vav. Now we know that in the Torah, I mentioned this many times, that in biblical Hebrew, I should say in all Hebrew, in Hebrew there are many words that could be written with a vav or without a vav. Because you can really write the same word matzot without the vav, and it would be matzot because the vav is really a vowel, but that same vowel could exist without the vav. The dot on top would be sufficient. So sometimes you write with a vav, sometimes you write without a vav. There are other letters like that in Hebrew, a yud. Sometimes you can write with a yud, sometimes you can write without a yud. Now, modern Hebrew seeks uniformity, seeks to be consistent. So when you pick up a modern Hebrew dictionary, on the first page, the dictionary is going to say, this dictionary does the full spelling. Full spelling means we put in all the vowels. Another dictionary would say, this dictionary does a missing spelling. What does missing spelling mean? Missing spelling means we don't put in all the vowels. So we try to be consistent. The problem with the Torah is completely inconsistent. Sometimes it has a vav, sometimes it doesn't have a vav. And even Rashi usually does not get into the question of why that is. So we believe there is a reason, but it's not always articulated when you study the simple interpretation. So when you're reading the simple interpretation of the verse, it doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily have to ask why sometimes the word has a vav and sometimes it doesn't. That's the way it is. Sometimes there's a very few places in Rashi where Rashi touches upon it. One was a few weeks ago, luchot. Luchot is written sometimes with a vav, sometimes without a vav. The tablets, the two tablets that with the 10 Commandments. So there, Rashi addresses why sometimes it says luchot without a vav, but most times Rashi doesn't say it. But it doesn't mean there's no reason. There is a reason, and here's case in point. If you look at the word matzah that I just showed you, you will see a fascinating concept that whenever it said matzah after midnight, it says it with a vav. Whenever it says matzah before midnight, in other words, when God tells the Jewish people 2 weeks before that on the 14th, the night of between the 14th and the 15th, you should eat matzot, there it doesn't have a vav. After midnight, it has a vav. Before midnight, it has no vav. Okay, that's very interesting. There must be a reason. So Rashi or the commentators which address the simple interpretation don't offer a reason, because that's the way the Torah is. You can't look for consistency in the spelling, right? Not everything has to be so precise when you're reading the pshat, when you're reading the simple level. But from the perspective of the Kabbalah, no. Everything is precise. And the vav is very significant. And the difference between the matzah before midnight and the matzah after midnight is expressed with the vav. Okay, so what happened at midnight? So if you read the Torah tells you that at midnight was the moment of the revelation. What do you mean? The death of the firstborn happened exactly at midnight. God tells the Jewish people that at midnight, Ani Yotzeh, I am going to pass through Egypt. I'm going to strike the firstborn Egyptians, and I am going to pass over your homes and protect you. This all will be at midnight. And at midnight was the moment that God goes through Egypt. What does it mean? The Egyptians died. The firstborn Egyptian died. But it's more than that. There's a spiritual revelation available at midnight. That's when God says, I myself, I'm descending through Egypt. Meaning to say, God reveals his presence. So if you're sitting in Egypt and you had your Seder, and it's the night of the Passover, and it's midnight, at midnight, you feel the revelation of God. You feel connected to God. Why midnight is another story. We can do another discourse about why midnight. Because midnight is the point where two things connect. And to connect two opposites, you have to actually transcend that system. So according to the Kabbalah, the first half of the night is judgment. Second half of the night is kindness. The point of midnight is the point that transcends both, to connect both. So the exact split nano instant of midnight is the moment where you transcend nature and you get to the essence of God that's beyond nature. But that's another story. The bottom line is, at midnight, there was revelation. Okay, now let's go back to the matzah. God says, in the evening, before midnight, you have to eat matzah. What does matzah mean? So we talk about this every year, but matzah represents humility. What does it mean, humility? To be aware of something greater than self, right? People think humility means to put yourself down. I'm so bad, I'm so terrible. That's not humility. That is being delusional, right? If you're the best basketball player in the world, if you're the best in your field, and you say, I'm humble, I'm not that good, you're just not being honest. See, I'm the worst person to do this. You're just simply not being honest. It's at best, it's dishonesty. At best, it's delusional. At worst, it's simply a lie, right? So humility from the perspective of Judaism doesn't mean that I don't know my qualities. Humility means that I see something greater than myself. And therefore, in comparison to that, I am humble. I don't focus on self. I focus on that which is greater than myself. So humility means I sense the presence of God. When I sense the presence of God, I don't sense myself. Now, that's what matzah does for us. What does it mean in the evening? What does it mean to eat matzah? I said before, matzah means the bread that will give you the awareness of your Father in heaven. Just like the physical bread gives you physical sustenance, the spiritual bread gives you and physical sustenance and awareness of your physical Father. So the spiritual bread gives you spiritual awareness of your Father in heaven. The way to be able to be aware of God is through humility. Humility means don't focus on self, focus on something that's greater than self. So here's the difference. There's two levels of matzah. There's the matzah that a person could achieve on their own before God reveals himself to them. In other words, the Jewish people were sitting 2 weeks before the revelation, and they can also create some humility. They can create some awareness of God. They could meditate about the greatness of God and have that awe. But the Kabbalah would call that awe yirat hata, the lower level of awe. Why is it the lower level of awe? Because you created it by yourself. It comes from your meditation. At midnight, when God reveals his presence to you, at that point, you reach a higher level of awe because it's not created by you. It's created by you sense the presence of God because God reveals himself to the people. Okay, I know I'm going all over, but in about 2-3 minutes, all the pieces of the puzzle are going to combine and we're going to have one story. And then we'll spend the last 4 minutes trying to just review. Okay, let's go back to the problems with the matzah. You have the matzah before midnight, does not have a vav. The matzah after midnight does have a vav. What does vav represent? So let's look at our vav. According to the Kabbalah, the letters represent the picture of the letters represent the energy that they represent. So the vav, matzot, the vav starts with a yud, a dot, and then it's a line. It draws down. So always in the Kabbalah, vav is revelation, drawing something down from a higher level to a lower level. So the revelation of God that happens at midnight is drawn down. In other words, the revelation of God that happens at midnight is represented by the vav. Vav means the presence of God has been revealed and drawn down to you. Now everything can start fitting in place. Let's see if we can put all the pieces of the puzzle together. If I remember everything we discussed. First thing is, before midnight, God tells the people, you have to eat matzah, which means you have to eat matzah, you have to become humble. How do you become humble? You have to be aware of something outside yourself. But that matzah, that awareness, you have to create on your own. And you have to try to create it. Now, what's interesting about that matzah, okay, you have to create that on your own. I can't give everything, I'm not going to fit everything in here. But you have to create that on your own. But that awareness is going to be a lower level of awareness. It's going to be the lower level of awe. After midnight, with the great revelation of God, we have the vav. Now, it's a second degree of matzah. It's a separate story of why we eat matzah. Why? It's a different revelation. It's a different awareness. It's the awareness that we can have of God after the revelation of midnight. Okay. Now, this helps the story of why, if we open up the translation again, what happened after midnight? Why? Okay, so it says, why do we? Because the dough of our ancestors had not had enough time to rise when suddenly the King of Kings, I'm sorry, this may be a mistake, unless my glasses are tricking me. When suddenly the King of the Kings of Kings, Melech Malchem, the King, okay, interesting translation. King of the Kings of Kings. Yeah, that's accurate. Melech Malchem Lachem. Melech is the King of the Kings of Kings. Okay. He revealed himself to them and liberated them. Just like it says in the story, they baked matzah from the dough that they had brought out of Egypt because it hadn't risen, because they had been chased out of Egypt and didn't have a chance to stick around long enough to pack anything else to eat. What do you see from this story? This story, they did not have to try to make matzah. The matzah happened by itself. It almost says it could not become chametz, ki lo chametz, because they translates because it hadn't risen. But the Hebrew says ki lo chametz, it cannot become chametz because they were chased out of Egypt. So if you think about it figuratively, the matzah before Egypt, the awareness that we create of God on our own, that takes effort. And you have to be very careful that your own ego, your own chametz doesn't get involved. So you have to guard it to make sure it doesn't become chametz. But after midnight, because the revelation comes from God, because the awareness of God comes from above, not from myself, I don't really have to do anything. It happens by itself. So there the story is, why didn't it become chametz? Not because I guarded it to make sure it didn't become chametz. It did not become chametz because it cannot become chametz. Why? I cannot have an ego when God reveals his presence to me. Okay, now is the final point, which Vicky mentioned earlier, and then we'll try to review and make sure at least we can take away a nugget of this and apply this to our own Pesach in a few days. Now, why did the Jewish people in Egypt have two stories? Because they had two separate levels. When they were in Egypt before midnight, they created their matzah. They had awareness of God. They had the humility, but that was self-made. That was the matzah without the vav, without the revelation of God, because God did not reveal himself to them yet. So they were there. So before midnight, when they had their Seder, they were on the lower level of awareness. Only the next day, after midnight, did they achieve the higher level of awareness. And that expressed itself that they ate matzah with a vav, and they didn't even have to work because automatically it would not become chametz, because when God's presence is revealed, there's no room for the ego. That's them. The original question we asked is, why is it that we're sitting before midnight and we're talking about the matzah that the Jewish people ate after midnight? And that was Vicky's answer. Vicky's answer was, because once we experience all this great spiritual revelation from where we live after the Torah was given. So we have Torah a whole year. We do commandments a whole year. So when we eat the matzah before midnight, the matzah we're eating already possesses the power of the matzah after midnight. And that's why when we eat our matzah, we can achieve the higher level of awareness, even though it's before midnight. Now all the pieces of the puzzle fit, but I'm going to try to at least give one or two nuggets to take away just to package it. It's all here. We got to pack it. It's all about packaging and marketing, right? When I was growing up, I don't know how it got to my house, but there was a book about people who made fortunes, and I was just going through their stories, like 18 millionaires, different. I don't know how it got to my house. The bottom line is this. The only thing I remember there, maybe that's why I'm not a millionaire, but the only thing I remember is one story. So the guy goes and buys a cosmetic company, and it wasn't making any money. And he turned the whole company around, and all of a sudden became a millionaire. What did he do? He says, I took the cosmetic, the bottle, whatever it is. I shrunk it a third of the size. If I was selling 9 ounces, now it's only 3 ounces, a third of the size and triple the price. And that's it. That was the business model. It's all about packaging, right? So you can sell a third of the price for a third of the product for triple the price, and people are going to buy it. So it's all how it's presented. So we have all the information here. Now we have to package it. Okay, so what are we really saying? We're saying in simple English that when I'm going to sit and when you're going to sit and you're Seder, Saturday night, a week from Saturday night, and you're eating the matzah. What is the matzah? Is it just a cracker that's supposed to remind us of historical event? No. Matzah, from the perspective of the Kabbalah, has the energy of creating awareness. Just like the Talmud says that a child will not recognize their father until they eat grain, spiritually, and Rabbi Shneur Zalman explains, because the grain has a superior spark to the human being. So too, when we eat the matzah is, like the Zohar says, it's the bread of faith, it's the bread of awareness. When we consume this physical bread, unleavened bread, that mitzvah, that matzah has the power to give us this awareness of Hashem. And that's the key to freedom, etc. Now, we have to understand that the matzah that we're eating, the awareness that we get, is not the awareness that we create on our own, which that is a lower level of awareness that we can create all year. The matzah that we're going to eat before midnight is the matzah is the awareness that we can get of the divine revelation that happened after midnight. And that's the takeaway, and that's the Kabbalistic idea. Matzah is the bread of awareness, the bread of faith. And when we consume the matzah on the night of Passover, after nightfall, the Chabad, the Rebbe instituted that we supposed to give shmura matzah. People should make sure all their family and friends have shmura matzah for the Seder. And so I bring someone shmura matzah, and he says, "Wonderful, it's too late, so we're gonna have an early Seder, and we're gonna eat the shmura matzah at 6 p.m." I say, okay, the shmura matzah is your dessert matzah. It's not the regular matzah, it's dessert matzah. You have to eat it after nightfall, because that's when the energy is available. So it's not the matzah, it's eating the matzah in the appropriate time. But when you do eat the matzah at the appropriate time, what's happening is you're having the bread of faith, the bread of awareness, and you're getting the bread of awareness that happened after midnight. In other words, the awareness of the revelation of God, the higher level of awe, the higher level of awareness, not that you create on your own through meditation, but that God gives you, and that is accessible to us. And if we're prepared, we can tap into that energy. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is one nugget, story in short, about the matzah, the story of matzah, which clarifies the inconsistencies of the story. There's 2 stories of matzah. Which one are we commemorating? The answer is, in those days, before midnight, they could not have the matzah of after midnight because the revelation didn't happen yet. Today, before midnight, we can have the awareness of after midnight. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. Any questions, comments, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day, wonderful Shabbos. And of course, enjoy your matzah. Make sure you eat it after midnight. You want to eat it before midnight, that's okay, but you have to eat it after midnight as well. And you'll have the awareness and the presence of God, which will bring you the faith. And like the Zohar says, that the first night, the matzah is the bread of faith. But then the next night, it's the bread of healing. Because if you have faith and you have awareness, that brings spiritual healing. And the spiritual healing brings the physical healing as well. So this Pesach should bring us awareness, spiritual healing, and physical healing, and only good things.
How's your leg?
Is there a connection between the word matzah, like